I've always had a fondness for spin-offs that have a little more freedom to flesh out a series' main characters and world, and there are a few series that make use of that freedom more than the Mario franchise. After all, Mario's platforming adventures are usually pretty straightforward, and outside of Mario Sunshine, they very rarely deviate from a familiar formula. Paper Mario: The Origami King is a great example of the Mushroom Kingdom and its inhabitants getting some time to shine thanks to its consistently clever writing, but despite a novel approach to turn-based combat, the game's excessive runtime and poor pacing, among other issues, leave me feeling burnt out on it as a whole. Paper Mario: The Origami King takes place in the aftermath of an origami festival gone awry. Bowser's minions have been transformed into mindless folded soldiers, the Toads have been scattered to the winds, and Princess Peach has joined the origami ranks of Ollie, the Origami King. It's up to Mario, with the help of the Origami King's sister, Olivia, to unfold the world and return peace to the Mushroom Kingdom. The game's strongest element is most certainly its writing, but that's not to say that the main plot is anything really special. Mario faces off against evil kings who take over the Mushroom Kingdom every other week, so the fact that this evil king is made of folded paper doesn't really make it any more interesting. However, the characters that you meet throughout Mario's journey and the various subplots that bookend each section of the game are genuinely surprising and entertaining. On an even smaller scale, Paper Mario: The Origami King is full of humorous moments and clever meta jokes that caught me off guard more than once, making for a very funny, very charming experience. Adding to that charm is the Paper Mario style that Origami King uses to great effect. The 2D character designs are some of my favorite iterations of the Mario cast to date, and the way their flat paper models bend and fold really sells the game's paper world. Conversely, there's something really soulless about the blank, staring origami enemies that makes them a genuinely threatening presence despite just being folded paper. The world that you're liberating from the folded soldiers is surprisingly varied and full of personality too. After a rather familiar beginning in Toad Town, Mario's travels take him to the serene Autumn Mountain, the sleepless Shroom City, and the wonderfully unique Shogun Studios theme park, just to name a few locations. And the soundtrack is just as diverse and fun as the world you explore, with massive shifts in style between remixes of classic Mario themes, more traditional East Asian-inspired tracks, and even hard rock arrangements. While this audio-visual variety does help Paper Mario: The Origami King from becoming a boring affair, the game doesn't hold up so well in a mechanical sense. That's not to say that Origami King doesn't bring some interesting ideas to the table, because it does. It's more that those ideas don't feel deep enough to cover such a long runtime, but more on that later. The Origami King is split into two halves: overworld exploration and platforming, and turn-based combat. The overworld gameplay is pretty straightforward adventure game fare. You'll run into obstacles or characters who need your help before going off to find the relevant item to remove the obstacle or fulfill the character's needs. Occasionally, the game will throw some proper challenges at you, such as sliding block puzzles or straight-up quizzes, and these sequences are easily among the game's most engaging parts, especially when compared to the game's usual fetch quests. Finally, these overworld sections are peppered with light platforming challenges, which are mostly pretty innocuous since, on the one hand, these sections aren't all that challenging, but on the other hand, the platforming just isn't that responsive or fun to do. The platforming is just kind of there for the most part. Much more interesting is what Paper Mario: The Origami King brings to the table during its turn-based combat encounters. Unlike previous Paper Mario games, which often feature more traditional turn-based RPG battles with multiple controllable party members, the focus here is on ring puzzles. Each fight puts Mario in the center of multiple rings that are segmented into even columns, and the main challenge of most encounters is to group the enemies scattered around the rings into attackable formations, specifically by rotating the rings and shifting columns up and down. Ultimately, you're trying to group enemies into lines or 2x2 boxes so that you can hit them with jump attacks or your hammer respectively, and if you line them up perfectly, you get a boost to your attack power. Conceptually, this is a really neat mechanic, though in practice, selecting specific rows and columns and then shifting them the way you want can be a little frustrating at times. For instance, your ring selection always shifts from the inner ring to the outer ring, so if you happen to overshoot your mark, you're forced to loop back around to choose the correct ring. Initially, it's also really unclear on which way the ring is going to turn when you try to turn it, since you're never sure if you're turning relative to the left or right side of the battle arena. Combine this mechanical confusion with a tight time limit for battles, and some of these encounters can be rather bothersome, especially in the early hours of the game. Thankfully, the game does have some features that alleviate some of those bothersome aspects. Fairly early on, you gain access to charms that can extend the battle time limits pretty significantly, and if you're rolling in money, you can also just pay to have more time on the clock. Alternatively, you can pay the Toads that you rescue along the way to help you out, forcing them to solve ring puzzles if you pay them the right amount. I think the time extenders are a great way of mitigating the pressure of these timed battles, but the Toad assists are honestly a bit much, since at that point, the game is practically playing itself. But hey, you do you. Now, if you're like me and use the Toad Assist sparingly, you'll find that the ring battles provide more depth once the Origami King starts introducing new enemy types. Not a ton of depth, since most of these enemy varieties boil down to ones that can't be hit with certain attacks, or ones that make the ring puzzles harder by only showing their positions temporarily, but hey, some depth is better than no depth. With that said, the majority of standard ring battles pale in comparison to the far less regular boss battles that flip the puzzle-based combat literally. These boss encounters put the bosses in the center of the ring and Mario on the outside edge, and instead of grouping enemies into formations, you now have to arrange symbols on the ring structure to direct Mario into a position where he can attack. The symbols on the ring range from arrows that push Mario in certain directions, to power-ups that let you take multiple or stronger attacks, and actual spaces from which you can attack. These boss battles are also where the game's special attacks usually come into play, requiring Mario to pass over an on switch before landing on the special attack symbol to actually use it. Outside of these bosses, your special moves are basically fancy keys for unlocking new overworld areas. My only real issue with the boss battles is that they usually require a decent amount of trial and error to figure out their individual gimmicks. Some bosses require you to use certain special moves at specific angles, while others need you to use a combination of special moves in the correct order to deal decent damage. The game mitigates this a little bit by allowing you to ask Olivia for help at any point during a battle, and the boss fights do have hints littered around the rings to help you out, but having the game spell these gimmicks out for you feels really cheap. And honestly, the game is sorely lacking in good conveyance as a whole, since it relies heavily on unnecessary dialogue to tell you things that you don't need to be told, while simultaneously leaving you in the dark on certain aspects like the aforementioned boss fights until you force it to spell everything out for you. There's no nice middle ground here. Not only that, but the game over-tutorializes players every time a new element is added to the gameplay, and even simple overworld quests can't escape the nagging hints and guidance coming from Olivia, your origami companion. This constant stopping and starting, coupled with the all-too-infrequent excitement of a new boss or area, feeds into what is potentially Paper Mario the Origami King's biggest issue: its pacing. Thanks to the relative simplicity of most combat encounters and the game's over-reliance on basic fetch quests in the overworld, the Origami King unfortunately feels like too little compelling content over far too much game. The prospect of interesting boss fights, fresh locations, and new side stories to dig into was enough to keep me pushing through, but I can't think of a single section of the game that didn't feel like it outstayed its welcome long before the next section rolled around. And none of this is helped by the fact that the game offers little in the way of character improvement. As I mentioned, there are charms that you can buy and equip, but for increased attack power, you'll mostly rely on breakable gear that you have to re-buy, which not only feels like a waste of time, but it kept me from feeling like Mario was progressively getting stronger, which he does, but only incrementally so. By the end, I was more than ready to be done with this game, which is unfortunate because it does offer plenty of extra content like collectibles and folded toads that need to be saved, and at this stage I have zero desire left to engage with any of it. With all that said, Paper Mario the Origami King is mediocre. For all its clever writing and charm, Paper Mario the Origami King is just too damn big for its own good. The novel approach to combat quickly wears thin, even with new enemy types to spice things up, and though each new area and subplot was fun to discover, the overarching plot just isn't compelling enough to warrant dedicating a 25-hour-long runtime to. I can't say that I don't recommend the game, because its writing, style, and unique mechanics are 100% worth experiencing for yourself, but it comes with the caveat that these elements may lose their appeal after hour 10 of a 25-hour-long game. Paper Mario the Origami King is available for Nintendo Switch.